Welcome to Mikon's Hardware. In this video I'm going to perform a comparison between Xeon E5-2640 V3 and Xeon E5-1650 V2. Both of the CPUs are gonna be installed onto the Huananzhi X99-TF motherboard using EVGA GeForce GTX 1080 graphics card, Samsung 850 Pro solid-state drive as the system boot drive, and 32GB of DDR4-3200 memory, which is currently represented by these G.Skill AMD compatible DDR4 RAM sticks. Of course, with the Xeon's processors, the RAM speed will be adjusted to the maximum available speed, but the RAM sticks are rated to 3200. Now, to make this comparison a little bit more interesting, I'm also throwing into the mix Ryzen 7 2700X. Ryzen 7 2700X is going to use the same graphics card, the same solid-state drive, and the same memory sticks. For the motherboard, I'm going to use MSI B450 Tomahawk MAX. Xeon E5-1650 V3 is going to be tested in its stock configuration as well as overclocked to 4.1 GHz. Yes, Huananzhi X99-TF is actually able to overclock Xeon E5-1650 V3. This processor has unlocked multiplier, and this motherboard is working correctly with this processor to overclock it. There are some more quirks and tweaks which you need to apply to perform the overclock. I will tell that a little bit later in the video. Now, unfortunately, I'm having here my not very powerful cooler, which is Noctua NH-L12. This cooler is not designed for extremely high overclocking, and my other more capable coolers do not have LJ2011 brackets. That's why I had to use this cooler. Theoretically, it's possible to overclock Xeon E5-1650 V3 on this motherboard to 4.2 or maybe even 4.3 GHz, but in my case, overclocking it to 4.2 and beyond required way too high voltage, which resulted in way too much heat, which my cooler is not capable of cooling up. What's about Xeon E5-2640 V3? This processor is going to be tested in its stock configuration as well as with turbo unlock when all of the 8 cores are running at 3.4 GHz. I hope this is going to be an interesting comparison. I'm going to run just a few synthetic benchmarks. Other than that, I will be focusing on gaming. Without further delay, let's go straight into the results. Let's start with the CPU Z benchmark. This is a pure synthetic benchmark which does not represent real-world performance of the CPUs, but it's still nice to see raw performance of the CPUs. As expected, Ryzen 7 2700X having the best result, having 8 cores and 4.3 GHz turbo boost on one core, gives 2700X 5100 points for the multi-core performance and 488 points for the single-core performance. Xeon E5-1650 V3 and E5-2640 V3 are showing very similar results. For single-core, Xeon E5-1650 V3 is slightly leading, having 413 points, while E5-2640 V3 is leading the multi-core performance with 3145 points. When overclocked to 4.1 GHz, E5-1650 V3 is pulling ahead with the single-core performance to 456 points and 3400 points for the multi-core performance. E5-2640 V3 with unlocked turbo boost increases its single-core performance ever so slightly to 378 points, while the multi-core performance is jumping to almost 3800 points. Cinebench R15 and R20. Two more very synthetic benchmarks, but unlike CPU Z, these benchmarks are actually representing real workload of the Cinema 4D application. The R15 version is not utilizing the modern instructions. That's why CPUs with older architecture are showing better results compared to the newer CPUs. Cinebench R20, on the other hand, is utilizing the newer instructions. Thus, when comparing newer CPUs to the older CPUs which do not support modern instructions, the gap between the CPUs might be bigger. Nevertheless, once again, Ryzen 7 2700X is leading entire pack, having 1800 points in R15 and 4100 points in R20. Xeon E5-1650 V3 and 2640 V3 are showing very similar results, with E5-2640 V3 is pulling ever so slightly, having 1300 points in R15 and 2900 points in Cinebench R20. Let's move on to the gaming benchmarks. The first game in my pack is gonna be Red Dead Redemption. As you can see from the graph, the performance of the CPUs is almost identical. Ryzen 7 2700X has the best maximum frame rate with 125 FPS, but it also has the worst minimum frame rate with just 42 FPS. This benchmark is not very consistent, but I ran each benchmark 3 times and getting averages, so this is more or less representative. Average FPS between all the CPUs tested is around 75 FPS. Xeon E5-1650 V3 with and without overclock is providing almost identical results. The same applies to Xeon E5-2640 V3 with or without Turbo Boost unlock. Red Dead Redemption 2 was tested at 720p and with the balanced preset. If you're interested, you can look at the screen and see all the detailed settings of the game which were used for this particular test. Battlefield 5. The game was also tested at 720p, and the list of all the graphical settings you can see on your screen. Here we start to see some differences between the CPUs. Ryzen 7 2700X and Xeon E5-2640 V3 with unlocked Turbo Boost to 3.4 GHz are providing the best results. Both of the CPUs are delivering exceptional performance with 199 FPS on average, around 190 minimal FPS, around 131% low FPS and around 0.1% low FPS. Much to my surprise, Xeon E5-1650 V3 without overclock is providing the worst 0.1% low results, having just 69 FPS. It's important to mention that these stutters are happening very seldom, but sometimes FPS is dropping to like 20 FPS, and that's where these 0.1 FPS are coming out. Overall performance was the worst on Xeon E5-2640 V3 without unlocked Turbo Boost, which is not able to fully utilize GTX 1080 at 720p, having just 185 FPS on average. Xeon E5-1650 V3 and Xeon E5-1650 V3 overclocked to 4.1 GHz are providing around 199 FPS on average, 180 minimal FPS, and 135 1% low FPS. Anyway, under realistic gaming conditions, for example playing with the GTX 1080 Ti and 1080p, or even 1440p, difference between these CPUs with unlocked Turbo Boost and with overclocking will be very minimal. Let's move to the Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I am testing the demo version. The performance in the real game might be slightly different, I'm not sure about that. For this test, I'm using the in-game benchmark, which is providing number of rendered frames as well as average FPS. In this game, Xeon E5-1650 V3 overclocked to 4.1 GHz is providing the best result, having 185 frames rendered and 116 frames on average. Ryzen 2700X, not overclocked E5-1650 V3, and Xeon E5-2640 V3 with unlocked Turbo Boost are all providing very similar values. 176 frames rendered and around 110 FPS on average. Xeon E5-2640 V3 is falling behind the rest of the CPUs, having 156 frames rendered and just 98 FPS on average. Yet again, we can see that the difference between the CPUs is very minimal, and under realistic gaming conditions, when the GPU is the bottleneck, the difference in performance will be very minimal. Cossacks 3. This is a very not optimized game, which is using just 1.5 CPU cores. Thus, it's not surprising that Ryzen 7, which has the highest CPU frequency, is providing the best results, with 27 FPS on average and 9 minimal FPS. Xeon E5-1650 V3 with and without overclock, as well as Xeon E5-2640 V3 with and without Turbo Boost unlock are providing very similar results, having 20 FPS on average and around 7 minimal FPS. Astroneer. Not very optimized game, but not as bad as Cossacks 3. Here we see that Ryzen 7 2700X is yet again leading the rest of the CPUs, having 86 FPS on average, 61 minimal FPS, and 28 1% low FPS. Xeon E5-1650 V3 at 4.1 GHz is having second place with 82 FPS on average, 61 minimal FPS, 27 1% low FPS. Xeon E5-2640 V3 with unlocked turbo boost and Xeon E5-1650 V3 without overclock are providing basically identical results, having 71 FPS on average, 50 minimal FPS, and 23 1% low FPS. Xeon E5-2640 V3 without unlocked turbo boost is falling behind, having 61 average FPS, 41 minimal FPS, and 21% low FPS. City Skylines. This game is very CPU intensive, it likes the number of CPU cores as well as CPU frequency. The game does not seem to be very optimized for the AMD Ryzen CPUs, thus we see that Ryzen 7 2700X, Xeon E5-1650 V3 with and without overclock, as well as Xeon E5-2640 V3 with unlocked turbo boost are all providing very similar results. Around 55 FPS on average, around 35 minimal FPS, and around 31% low FPS. Xeon E5-2640 V3 without unlocked turbo boost is having 44 averages FPS, 26 minimal FPS, and 23 1% low FPS. World of Tanks Encore. This is a benchmark to demonstrate ray tracing capabilities in the World of Tanks game, but for this benchmark I have disabled ray tracing and using 720p resolution. Much to my surprise, Xeon E5-2640 V3 with unlocked turbo boost is providing the best result, having 57,000 points. The second place is going to Xeon E5-1650 V3 at 4.1 GHz with 56,000 points. Ryzen 7 2700X and Xeon E5-1650 V3 without overclocking are providing basically identical results with 55,000 points. Xeon E5-2640 V3 without turbo boost unlocked is falling behind with just 52,000 points. Now let's look at the prices of this configuration. Xeon E5-1650 V3 currently is being sold on AliExpress for around 100 euros. Huananzhi X99-TF also costs around 100 euros. For the memory you can pick 2 or 4 sticks of G.Skill DDR4-3200 or 2600. 2 sticks 8GB each are gonna cost 50 euros. Thus entire set with the Xeon E5-1650 V3 gonna cost 250 euros. The same set with the Xeon E5-2640 V3 is gonna cost around 210 euros. Xeon E5-2640 V3 is very popular CPU, that's why its price has been risen from 50 euros to 60 euros. This is not very pleasant, but 60 euros is still a fair price for this CPU. Ryzen 7 2700X can be purchased from AliExpress for just 120 euros. MSI B450 Tomahawk can be found for around 125 euros. 2 sticks of Crucial Ballistic DDR4-3000 or DDR4-3200 are gonna cost around 65 euros. Thus, the all Ryzen set is gonna cost 310 euros. Of course, it's possible to get cheaper motherboards on AM4 platform as well as on the LGA 2011 platform. But with this configuration, Ryzen set is 100 euros more than Xeon E5-2640 V3, while providing basically identical gaming performance. In some games we can see that the performance is slightly better, in other games it's slightly worse. Of course, AM4 is a much better platform, and if you're ready to invest into the new motherboard and the new RAM sticks and get Ryzen 7 2700X from AliExpress, this is a very good combo. Ryzen 7 2700X is also going to completely destroy Xeon E5-2640 V3 in workload tasks. But if you are just looking for a very cheap combo for pure gaming, then in my opinion, Xeon E5-2640 V3 with cheap memory and cheap Chinese LGA 2011 version 3 motherboard is the way to go. In this particular case, I'm having Huananzhi X99-TF, which costs 100 euros, and having way more features than regular gamer would need to. For example, DDR3 support is absolutely useless here. Having 3 PCI Express x 16 slots is also not really needed for the average gamers. 8 SATA 3 ports is an overkill as well. Still, not everything is as bright as I would hope for. With the Xeon E5-2640 V3, you have to unlock Turbo Boost to get the best out of this CPU. Even without unlocking Turbo Boost, you will still get very decent performance. In the games which are able to utilize multiple cores, this CPU has enough CPU cores. In the games which are utilizing just 1 or 2 CPU cores, this CPU is gonna turbo boost to 3.0, 3.1, 3.2 up to 3.4 GHz. When unlocking turbo boost, you need to understand that you are risking to break your motherboard by flashing incompatible BIOS, by having Intel power interruption during the BIOS flashing process. You also need to understand that you would have to reinstall CPU drivers every now and then. For example, after Windows update, I had to reinstall drivers. After BIOS reset and updating some power management settings or CPU overclocking settings, I had to reinstall driver. Sometimes when testing overclocking and Windows is crashing and then Windows decides to restore its previous state, the driver is gone again, so you need to reinstall this driver. Without the driver installation, the system is not gonna work. It's gonna freeze and lag. Still, overall, I could say that unlocking Turbo Boost on Xeon E5-2640 V3 worth it, if you are technical enough and if you are ready to go for the risk for the sake of the reward. One more important thing about Turbo Boost unlock is that CPU is not going to work at 3.4 GHz all the time. CPU has built-in power consumption limitation. And this limitation is going to prevent CPU from turbo boosting higher if the power consumption is going too high. For example, running Cinebench R15, which does not utilize modern heavy instructions, CPU is happily running at 3.4 GHz. But running Prime 95 test, which is utilizing modern instructions, is forcing CPU to consume extra power, thus CPU drops its frequency to 3.0 GHz. Unfortunately, adjusting power settings in the BIOS or trying to use Intel Extreme Tuning utility to increase power package of the CPU does not have any effect on the Huananzhi X99-TF motherboard. Now, what about Xeon E5-1650 V3? In my opinion, this CPU is overpriced. Right now it's being sold for 100 euros, while I think it shall cost around 60-70 euros. The CPU is having just 6 cores. Still, when overclocked to 4.1, 4.2, 4.3 GHz, it's consuming quite significant amount of power and producing quite some heat. Thus you need an expensive cooler to dissipate all of this heat, otherwise CPU is gonna go to 94 degrees Celsius and start to throttle. Overclocking CPU on Huananzhi X99-TF is also not flawless. You can apply basic overclocking settings to the CPU, and CPU-Z is going to demonstrate you that maximum CPU multiplier is gonna be 41, 42 or whatever value you specify. But the power consumption and the maximum current limits within the CPUs are not gonna be adjusted. You need to do that manually through the Intel Extreme Tuning utility. Without these adjustments under heavy workloads such as Prime 95 or Cinebench R20, Xeon E5-1650 V3 is going to downclock itself from the specified multiplier in the BIOS. If I would have to pick between Xeon E5-1650 V3 and Xeon E5-2640 V3, I would definitely go with the Xeon E5-2640 V3. Originally, I planned to add to this comparison i7-5820K and i7-6800K, but these happen to be way too many benchmarks and I have to invest a lot of time to complete this video. That's why I decided to release it with just 3 CPUs and 5 configurations tested. I hope you have enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, goodbye.